Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax, and this is The Story. We're back with more of Eric Scatterbo chatting with Ed Somerville, author of the book When Granddaddy Was Little Eddie, Tales from an Appalachian Boyhood. As we heard before the break, Ed was sharing about the time he and his little brothers decided to give the family cat a hysterectomy, and we're having some troubles. You're not going to believe what happened next, and please do not try this at home.
So we stitched her back up. Mm-hmm. Little Jimmy pulled the cone off of her, and sure enough, in a couple of minutes, her eyes kind of fluttered open. We took an aspirin and poked it down her throat and set her gently down into a cardboard box in the corner. And after a little while, she was meowing, and after a little while, she was kind of looking like not that bad for the wear and tear. She might have been through 1 or 2 of her 8 lives, but she was definitely going to make it. And so we thought things were good.
Yeah.
Until 2 or 3 days later, little Jimmy comes running to me and he says, Addie, he says, there's something wrong with Tigger. And I said, what? He said, she's been chewing on the stitches that we put in her, she's chewed them all the way out. He said, she's hanging open like a suitcase. Well, as it happened, Mom and Dad had gone off on another errand. We put the bathrobes back on and the handkerchiefs. We dropped Tigger back into the fish tank, poured the ether in, clapped the plywood on top, and things were going well until we noticed that this time something was different. Tigger was having a reaction, and it was a bad, strong reaction to the ether where this thick mucus was just coming out of her mouth and hanging down, and it was disgusting, but eventually she dropped over asleep. So we pulled her out of the fish tank and stretched her on the table, got out in the sewing kit, and we started working on stitching up her side again. We finally got one side done.
Oh, wow.
Little Jimmy was working on his ether cone, administering the anesthesia, and we flipped her the other side and had her halfway stitched, almost all the way stitched up. And I don't know what happened, but little Jimmy, his attention span just couldn't hold in there. He got distracted, so busy looking at us doing work on the stitches that he forgot to notice if Tigger was breathing or not.
Oh, no.
And guess what happened?
What happened?
Tigger stopped breathing.
Oh, no.
And little Jimmy looked up at me and he said, Ed, he said, Tigger stopped breathing. Quick, we've got to do something. Well, as an older brother, you have to be prepared for these kind of emergencies. So I looked at him and said, not to worry, Jimmy. I said, I've trained for this. And with that, I pulled a toilet paper tube out of my back pocket, and I said, right here I have a resuscitator, and we're going to get Tigger back breathing again right in a moment here. Just hang in there. So I put that tube, one end of my mouth and the other end over Tigger's mouth, and I began to start blowing oxygen down her throat and into her little furry lungs. It was kind of like blowing up a little fuzzy football. And in went the good air. And, as they say, in with the good air, out with the bad.
Yeah.
The only problem was the bad air was not coming out.
Oh, no.
So I puffed a little bit more air in there, and the bad air wasn't coming out. So I began to gently press down on her ribs, trying to get the bad air to come out.
Yeah.
Nothing. So I pressed harder, and nothing. And I thought to myself, if I press any harder, these stitches are all going to pop loose on this cat. And I became desperate in that moment. I knew I had to do something because little Jimmy was crying and he was screaming about brain damage setting in on his cat. We had to do something.
Yeah.
And so in a moment of hysteria, I reached over on that toilet paper tube, and with all my might, I sucked back and inhaled that air. And I found out what it was that was causing the air not to come out. It was a hairball that had been stuck in the back of her throat. It shot through the toilet paper tube and hit me in the back of the throat.
Oh, no.
And I gagged and fell into the corner of the room. I crushed that toilet paper tube. I spit out that hairball, and I said, that cat will die before I do that again. Now, little Jimmy, it was his beloved cat, and he knew that it was up to him. And in that moment, toilet paper tube or no, he went mouth to mouth on poor little Tigger and began to puff breaths of life back into her. And if you can believe it, Eric, that cat started to breathe again.
Oh, my goodness.
Next thing you know, she was meowing around, and we gave her another
Really?
aspirin. And 2 or 3 days later, Jimmy came back to me and said, "Ed, you're not going to believe this." I said, "What?" He said, "She's chewed her stitches out
Oh,
again."
no. Oh, no.
And I looked at him, I said, "Every man has his limit." I said, "That's it. She's on her own from here on out. I'm not going to have anything to do with her after that." And believe it or not, Eric, 2 or 3 days afterwards, that cat had healed up, grown fur back over the scars, and you would never have known that she had been on the operating table under the knife. That's just about the end of that story, except for 6 months later, my dad was out in the barn, and he found Tigger with one tiny little kitten beside her. And he had promised that there was going to be a consequence if Tigger kept on having kittens. But as he sat there and studied her, he looked into her face, and he could see this expression, an expression of, like, deep suffering. And I believe something touched his heart, and he had compassion, and he decided to let Tigger live. So that was the end of that story. Tigger made it, and little Jimmy was happy with that.
So at 15 years old, your first operation was a success. Kind of. Well, the patient lived anyway.
Kind of, but I didn't decide to go into medicine. I heard that doctors never slept, and then God, with his sense of humor, eventually sent me 8 children. And you can imagine, with 8 children, I haven't slept since.
Oh, I can imagine. As a side note, we should say you went on to be a principal of a school. So all that education helped you out, but you didn't go into medicine.
No, but I've spent a lot of time with young people. And so I went off to college to study to be a teacher. I was going to teach the middle grades. And that was one reason I went to college. The other reason was, though, I was looking for that beautiful young girl that was going to wind up being my bride and my companion for life, you know?
Yeah.
That was my ulterior motive going off to college. And I'd been through about 3 years of college, and I was getting kind of desperate. And I had not found that exact one. It was just God's perfect gift for my life. Now, what I had done is I'd started to work in Christian camps as a camp counselor, which I was, in a dictionary, you could have my picture beside camp counselor, because I believe God just made me for that kind of a job.
Oh, is that right?
With all the experience I'd had with my little brothers and all the fun we'd had hiking through the mountains and camping out and swimming in the river and everything. Well, I had been a counselor one summer, and I was getting ready to go back for my second summer, and I wanted to make this summer really special, and I wanted to really have something to share with my campers that year, not just my funny stories or jokes, but I wanted to have something from God. And so I told my parents, it was about a week before the camp was to begin, I said to my parents, I'm going to take a couple of jugs of water and my sleeping bag, and I'm going to hike up into the mountains with my Bible, and I'm going to have a personal retreat. My goal is to read through the whole New Testament and just underline and take notes and be ready for whatever my campers happen to bring to me, so that I'll have God's wisdom and God's word to be able to counsel them with.
Yep.
And so I headed out the back door and up the mountain. I knew of a little log cabin up in the hills, and my dog decided to follow me. I tried to discourage her because I wasn't taking along any dog food, but she was loyal and determined. So I got up to the cabin, I started on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and got into the epistles by that night and stretched out in this little cabin. Now, you have to picture this. It's a log cabin, but it's tiny. It just has room for a little bunk bed made out of slabs of boards, no mattress. It's got a little bit of dirt floor. And where they've cut the logs down to build this cabin, it's all grown back in briars and thorn bushes. So I'm having a great time reading through all of Paul's writings the second day, and almost down to, the books of Peter and 1st and 2nd John, and it's nighttime that second night. And I've been fasting all this time, and just having a wonderful time in the Word. And in the middle of that second night, I'm awoken by my dog barking furiously. And I sit up, and I'm a country boy, so I'm not too concerned. I'm thinking, well, maybe there's a possum or a rabbit or a squirrel that's wandered into the cabin.
Yeah.
I had taken along water and a Bible, but I'd forgotten to take a torch. So it's pitch black, and I heard this noise, so I threw a boot at it, and suddenly it froze. That's the exact behavior of a reptile. So I picked up another boot and threw it, and I heard this sound of a rattling noise, and I thought, oh, my word, I'm stuck here in this cabin with a rattlesnake.
Oh, no.
And so I'm in this cabin in the pitch black on the top of a mountain, kilometers from home, with a rattlesnake. What do you do?
Oh,
I didn't panic.
Yeah.
But I'd heard too many stories about rattlesnakes crawling into campers' sleeping bags because they're cold-blooded, and they're looking for a warm place. And I didn't want that to happen to me.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So I got up my nerve, and I scooped up my sleeping bag, and I took one leap to hit the floor and get outside the door, thanking God that I hadn't been bitten. But now what do I do? I'm surrounded by all these acres of thorn bushes and briars. It's pitch black. What do I do? Where do I go?
Yeah.
The thought hit me. I'm going to climb up the side of these logs and get on the roof of this cabin, and that's where I'll spend the rest of the night. Unfortunately, every time I twitched or turned, I would start sliding down off the roof, so I had to keep inching my way back up like a caterpillar. And I got to the place where I was getting a little bit, starting to grumble a little bit, and that's when the Lord said to me, he said, remind me why you came up on top of this mountain. And I said, I was trying to get closer to God. He said, well, there you are on the top of the mountain. Now you're on top of the roof of your cabin. How close do you want to get? So I said, okay, you're right. So instead of sleeping, I'll just spend time in prayer. And I began to pray about one thing and another in the summer, and the campers and the other counselors and the staff. And I went through my whole list. And it wasn't until the very end that I began to start to be reminded of the deeper things that were deep inside of me, my worries and my concerns, and would I ever find that right person that God had for me to marry? And so I began to pour my heart out to God, and it was one of those moments. He gave me a picture, a father with strong arms, and he was holding a little child in those arms. And he said, you see that child? I said, yes. He said, that's you. And he said, you see those strong arms? I said, yep. He said, those are my arms. And he said, remember, in my word it says, my grace is sufficient for you. And he says, if you never meet that girl and you never get married, my grace will always be sufficient for you. And he said, on the other hand, if you get married next week, he said, you'll probably need even more grace, but it will be sufficient for you. Just trust me. And that night I was able to put my fears and anxieties into God's arms because I knew that he was holding me in his strong arms. And just then a raindrop hit me right between the eyes. And then another, and another.
Oh, no.
Oh, I didn't know what I was going to do. So I shimmied back down off the side of the roof, down the side of the cabin. And there was in that bunk bed, there was just enough early morning light to see that there was no snake on the top bunk. So I got up my courage and took another jump in there and landed on the top bunk, curled up and went to sleep. I slept peacefully and just for several hours. And when I finally woke up, the sun was pouring in, and packed my things up and headed down the mountain. Well, 1 week to the day, I was at camp on the first day of staff training, and, I thought I would be gallant and help the girl counselors, carry their suitcases down to their cabins. And on that day, you're never going to guess who I met for the first time.
I kind of have an idea.
Debbie. Debbie, the girl that would wind up being my wife and the mother of my 8 children. Exactly 1 week to the day after God had told me not to be afraid and anxious, not to worry, and that his grace would be sufficient. And you know what?
Yep.
It's been 41 years since we've been married, and 8 kids, and a whole another 3 or 4 books full of adventures, and God's grace has been sufficient all those years.
Well, that was part 2 of Eric Scatterbo chatting with storyteller extraordinaire Ed Somerville, who's the author of the book When Granddaddy Was Little Eddie, Tales from an Appalachian Boyhood, which is available online. And boy, Ed's really had some adventures in his childhood and into his young adult years, which were mostly pretty light-hearted. However, next time things take a more serious turn as Ed begins to share about his life on the mission field in Mexico when a tragic event occurs. But before we end today, I want to share some Bible verses that tie in with what Ed just shared at the end. The Bible says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in prayer let your requests be known to God. And God says, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So, we know that if we trust God, we don't have to worry about anything. And we know His grace is sufficient for all our needs. Those are wonderful promises that we can build our lives on. Well, until next time, when we'll hear part 3 of Ed Somerville's stories, I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Next time on The Story.
As she was standing there waiting for chickens, she thought he was hitting her until she saw a flash in his hand and realized that he had a knife. And she finally fell to the ground, and he took her purse, and he took off running down the street. But meanwhile, Debbie has come to me and fallen into my arms, and I'm just holding her, and she says to me, she just, let's pray. She says, pray that the devil does not get any glory out of this.
Ed Somerville had quite an adventurous, carefree childhood, growing up in the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern part of the United States. But things took a very serious turn when just 6 weeks into being a missionary with his wife, tragedy struck. We'll find out what happened and how God got the glory through it all next time.
The Story. Just another way Vision is connecting faith to life.